Thank you and good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker. Viet Thanh Nguyen was born in Vietnam and raised in America. He is the author of The Committed, which continues the story of the Sympathizer, which was awarded the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, along with several other awards. He is the author of the short story collection, The Refugees, the nonfiction book, Nothing Ever Dies, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, and is the editor of an anthology of refugee writing, The Displaced. He is the Errol Arnold Professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundations. He lives in Los Angeles, and please let's give a warm Tucson welcome for Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Dr. Bider, and good evening, Tucson. Like Annette Gordon-Reed, I also came from another place, Dallas, and the weather is also better here compared to Dallas as well. It's a thrill to be back here in Tucson, and I'm going to make my own pitch. Tomorrow I will be on a panel with founder Luis Alberto Urrea. Come out and hear us talk. All right. Meanwhile, it is an honor to be here before you, assembled readers, writers, booksellers, and most of all, lovers of books. I've had a love affair with books almost as long as I've had memory. Books in general, and literature specifically, were my first love outside of the love I had for my family. But while I didn't choose my family, I did choose books. And it was through books, literature, and storytelling that I found my voice, learned to speak, and began grappling with what it meant to speak for others. I wrote and drew my first book when I was in the 3rd grade in San Jose, California, around 1980. The students in my school were mostly Vietnamese refugees and Mexican and Latino immigrants, or the children of such immigrants. I had friends named Pablo, Benito, Duc, and Du. In the schoolyard, we Vietnamese boys formed rival gangs at a very young age. We flailed at each other harmlessly. I showed early signs of my trademark cowardice and hung back at the rear of our little gang. I'd already gotten into an after-school fist fight in the 2nd grade with a black boy named Marcus. We punched each other in the face for a minute or two, and afterwards wiped away the blood and shook hands. I don't think we even knew why we had fought in the first place. It would be my first and last fist fight, but not my last fight. As a writer, I would come to believe in Muhammad Ali's words that writing is fighting. And in the 2nd grade, I'd already taken the first step in my training by spending most of my time with books and stories rather than with people. I was very good at being alone. I started wearing glasses in the 2nd grade, which my father blamed on me reading too much in dim light. But that reading had another effect. It fired my imagination, where I could see perfectly. So, when my 3rd grade teacher told us to write and draw our own books, I was ready. My book was Lester the Cat. Lester was an urban cat, stricken with ennui. Bored of city life, he fled to the countryside. There, in a hay-strewn barn, he found love with a country cat. Unexpectedly, the San Jose Public Library gave Lester the cat a book award. My first taste of literary fame. I had never thought of being a writer before Lester the cat, and I'm forever grateful to the San Jose Public Library for encouraging me and setting me on the path to over 30 years of misery trying to become a writer. My school librarian, a kindly white-haired woman, took me to the award ceremony. There was a hotel across the street from the library, and she treated me to a hamburger in the hotel restaurant, which was the fanciest place I had ever been in my 8-year-old mind. My family were refugees, and the only times we ever ate out were at a pho restaurant after Vietnamese language mass on Sundays. This was long before pho was fashionable. Decades before celebrity chef Rachel Ray would offend all Vietnamese people with her faux pho. Back then, the only people in this pho restaurant were Vietnamese, and the only language spoken was Vietnamese. We all ate pho the ambidextrous Vietnamese way. Chopsticks in one hand, spoon in the other, surrounded by a hubbub of Vietnamese voices. The pho restaurant was part of an international chain spread across the Vietnamese refugee diaspora. Years later, I heard rumors that the chain was funneling its profits to the remnants of the South Vietnamese army in exile, intent on taking back Vietnam from the victorious communists. San Jose was home to one of the largest populations of Vietnamese refugees in the world, and during our community celebrations like Tết, Vietnamese veterans in camouflage uniforms would guard the gates. We sang the South Vietnamese national anthem. And in the exhibition hall of the Tết Festival, I saw pictures of South Vietnamese guerrillas somewhere in a jungle, training to invade Vietnam. My parents were anti-communists too, but they were more intent on saving our lives than fighting wars. Saving our lives meant working themselves to exhaustion at the Saigon Mui, their grocery store in downtown San Jose. 12 to 14-hour days, almost every day of the year, which is why neither of my parents could take me to the library for my award. Now, this library, a massive white cube named after Martin Luther King Jr., was the biggest building I knew. It was also my second home, a place I felt more at home in than I did in my parents' home. We lived next to the entrance ramp of the 280 freeway in a house with iron bars on all its windows. When I was 16, a white male gunman followed my parents home from the Saigon Mui, broke into our house, and aimed his gun in all our faces. When he told us to get on our knees, I, the coward, silently obeyed, as did my father. My mother saved our lives by dashing past the gunman and running, screaming, into the street. I saw her through the living room window, but I couldn't hear her voice as she ran past all the cars heading for the freeway. My bedroom window had a view of this freeway entrance ramp, and that night, as I watched the stream of cars ascend the ramp, I wondered where they were going, and I wanted to go with them. The library offered me a way out. Inside the library was a world without borders for a refugee boy who had been forced to cross borders. Books could deliver me across time and space, away from the house with its barred windows, away from the Saigon Mui, where my parents had been shot in their store on Christmas Eve when I was 7. My brother and I were home alone. I was watching cartoons. 7 years older, my brother took the phone call. When he told me, I was speechless. My parents returned to work at the Saigon Mui within a day or two. They had to live, and to live, they had to work, and it was only flesh wounds. We never spoke of that incident again. So when my parents could not make it the next year to my award ceremony, who was I to say anything? They were working to save our lives, and not just ours, but all the relatives back in a starving Vietnam, including my parents' parents and my adopted sister. We had left her behind at age 16 by herself to safeguard the family property, which the victorious communists confiscated anyway. I had no memory of my grandparents or this adopted sister, whom I last saw when I was 4. Growing up in that house of barred windows, I was aware of absent presences, of ghosts, of missing persons, of the faces of my grandparents in black and white pictures looking at me without speaking. They all died before I could return to Vietnam and hear their voices. Part of me longed to hear the voices of the Vietnamese diaspora and the Vietnamese people, even as part of me didn't want to hear those voices. I had come to the United States at age 4, fluent in Vietnamese, and all these decades later, I am still fluent in Vietnamese at a 4-year-old level. My monolingualism, my linguistic infantilism, is one of the things that makes me an American. My resistance to Vietnamese came about because I grew up as an American, and my poor parents, aware that they were raising an American alien in their household, sent me to Vietnamese Catholic Sunday school, which was actually the quickest way to guarantee that I would never learn Vietnamese. Didn't want to learn Vietnamese by reading the Bible, and I did not want to listen to the drone of the priest. And yet, I yearned to hear the voices of Vietnamese people because as an American, I understood how Americans saw and heard, or didn't hear, Vietnamese people. I watched almost all of Hollywood's Vietnam War movies, which is an exercise I recommend to no one, especially if you're Vietnamese. When Americans said Vietnam, they really meant the Vietnam War, but whether they meant the country or the war, Vietnam for Americans was an American drama, an American civil war, a conflict in the American soul in which we were the extras. It was strange that this was our country and our war, and yet our only place in American movies was to be killed, raped, threatened, or rescued. All we could do was scream, cry, beg, threaten, or curse, and if we could say anything at all, it was either, "Me love you long time," or "Thank you for being rescued." Of course, we were never so rude as to mention, at least in English, that we wouldn't have needed to be rescued by Americans if we hadn't been invaded by Americans in the first place. The situation in the library was not much better. The books about Vietnam were mostly about the war and therefore mostly about Americans. There was a well-intentioned children's book about a Vietnamese refugee, but I didn't recognize myself in its world of rice paddies, water buffaloes, and half-naked peasant boys. I finally found the novel Blue Dragon, White Tiger by Viet Thanh Nguyen, a diplomat writing about the war from the South Vietnamese point of view, and perhaps the first Vietnamese writer to write fiction in English. He said, "I am a Vietnamese by birth, an American by choice." And an echo of it must have stuck in my head, for decades later I would write, "I was born in Vietnam, but made in America." His novel put another thought in my head. We could write about our own experiences in English, an adopted tongue that felt like my native tongue. But almost all of my reading in this second home of the library was not about me or anyone who looked like me. Almost everything I read was by and about white people. And through those books and watching TV and the movies, which were also almost all about white people, I became an anthropologist of white people, knowing them far, far better than they knew me or people like me. It was natural, therefore, to become an English major in college. For reading in English was the one thing I was good at. Ironically, during my time at Berkeley, I read Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in Middle English twice, while I had to read Nguyễn Du's classic epic, The Tale of Gyu, in translation from Vietnamese into English. If English had become just like my native tongue, it came at the expense of losing my mother tongue. Nevertheless, even though Berkeley's English department disciplined me into the canon by having me read the whole of English literature, from Beowulf through Shakespeare, the Victorians, the American Renaissance, and modernism, I hung on to this stubborn desire to hear the voices of Vietnamese people. When I continued at Berkeley to get a PhD in English, I decided to write a dissertation on Vietnamese American literature. But when I told this to the chair of the English department, a famous Americanist, he said, "No, you can't do that. You won't get a job." And perhaps in 1992, he was right. But if I were him, I would have said, "I want you to know you may not get a job, but I also want you to know that you should do what you want, as long as you understand that the world does not want to hear your voice. That's the world's problem, not yours." But he didn't tell me that, and I didn't have the courage of my convictions, so I wrote a dissertation on Asian American literature. 27 years later, however, I would have the opportunity to give a presentation to the Modern Language Association at the invitation of its president. My talk was on Vietnamese American literature. In those 27 years, Vietnamese American writers established Vietnamese American literature as an undeniable field, with books like Lê Thị Diêm Thuy's The Gangster We're All Looking For, Monique Jung's The Book of Salt, Andrew X-Phamp's Catfish and Mandala, Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and many others. In those 27 years, I also struggled to find my voice. In my English graduate seminars and later as a professor in English department faculty meetings, I barely said a word, feeling like an imposter and a trespasser. At home with my parents, I also barely said a word. The linguistic and cultural gap between us had grown very wide. I had told my parents I was going to become a doctor. "Really?" they said. "An English doctor," I said. Their faces fell. How could I explain to my parents that I loved reading Jane Austen and the Romantics? And how could I explain that Asian American literature had saved me because it showed me that a writer could look like me and that I could look like a writer? The language my parents and I shared, Vietnamese, was a stunted one because of me. And yet, as stunted as that language was, the language that I had mastered, English, gave me access to the entire world because its speakers had mastered the world through invasion, enslavement, colonialism, warfare, and capitalism. Still, I dedicated myself to this complicated tongue, and after more than 30 years of misery, I did become a writer. My first novel, The Sympathizer, was unexpectedly successful. I say unexpectedly because it was rejected by 13 out of 14 publishers. As one editor put it in his rejection, I kept all the rejections. He just had too much trouble crawling all the way inside the voice. I understood why, especially given how I had spent a lifetime ever since my earliest days in the San Jose Public Library, crawling all the way inside the voices of so many white writers. When those white writers were writing, did they imagine that they would be speaking to a young Vietnamese refugee boy? Probably not. Was I nevertheless spoken to? Yes, because their voices were beautiful. And because I knew that if I wanted to survive in this country, I had to keep quiet and listen to these masterful voices. One lesson I learned intuitively was that all those white writers I read and admired didn't need and shouldn't need to worry about whether a young Vietnamese refugee boy was ever going to read them. That's not their obligation. Therefore, the lesson I had to learn consciously was that I, as a writer, who also happened to be a Vietnamese refugee writer and an Asian American writer, I didn't need to and shouldn't need to worry about whether non-Vietnamese people would read me. My obligation was not to care about whether anyone, white, black, or otherwise, could crawl into my voice. My obligation was to speak as if everyone could already understand what I said. That's an assumption a person of the so-called majority makes all the time, an assumption born from the privilege of being the beneficiary of imperialism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. It's an assumption that a person of a so-called minority may find hard to make. At least it was hard for me. To find my voice, I stopped thinking of myself as a minority, even though I still sometimes find myself to be the only Asian in the room. But I'm not a minority if I think of myself as being part of a world, a globe, where white people are the minority. I'm also not a minority if, when I write, I'm writing first of all to myself, because I contain multitudes. And I'm not a minority if I write to Vietnamese people. Everyone else can listen in. So the conceit of my novel, The Sympathizer, and if you haven't read The Sympathizer, shame on you, but the conceit of this novel is that it is a confession written by our Vietnamese narrator to his Vietnamese interrogator. If a Vietnamese person speaks to another Vietnamese person, there is no translation. If I were to write in the voice of our narrator, I would like a bowl of pho, comma, a delicious beef noodle soup, comma, then a sensitive reader would know that I am not talking to Vietnamese people. I would be translating for non-Vietnamese readers. People of the so-called majority, used to never translating themselves, used to always being translated to, might not notice this translation, this catering, this invitation to crawl inside the voice of the writer who has turned himself into a translator. But imagine how you would feel if Jonathan Franzen wrote, I would like a sandwich, comma, 2 slices of bread, between which there's something delicious, comma. Franzen wouldn't do that. Franzen wouldn't translate because he assumes his audience knows what he's talking about, or should know what he's talking about. And that is the right stance to take. So, so-called minority writers, do not translate. And readers of so-called minority literature, do not expect or demand translation. Translation, at least within a book written by a so-called minority, is more often than not a deformation of the voice, the sign of the so-called minority accepting their subjugated status. For me, refusing to translate was crucial to denying subjugation, which was inextricable from finding and claiming my voice. Refusing to translate was also my way of refusing to be a translator for Vietnamese people to non-Vietnamese people, which was also a refusal to be the representative of Vietnamese people. Too often, so-called minority writers are expected to be the translators and representatives of their people, even when they're just writing fiction or poetry, a burden not usually placed on so-called majority writers. Given my refusal, it was a surprise, and yet not a surprise, that a major book review of The Sympathizer called me a voice for the voiceless. And I thought, have you ever eaten at a Vietnamese restaurant, visited a Vietnamese home, hung out with Vietnamese people? We're really, really loud. As Arundhati Roy puts it, there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. I'll tell her you applauded that line. What does it mean then for someone to find their voice when they are told that their voice is heard so much more clearly against the voicelessness of those others who are just like them? Those who want to hear a voice for the voiceless may actually be just as invested in not hearing the cacophony and the chorus of those they assume to be voiceless. It's easier to hear just the one voice. This is one reason why I reject the notion of the writer as only being a solitary artist whose task it is to find his or her or their voice. Of course, much of the writer's work is solitary. During my 30 years of misery, I spent thousands of hours alone, facing a screen and a blank wall. But always present with me were the voices of all those Vietnamese people I knew and all the Vietnamese people I had encountered in movies and books. Always there for me were the voices of the Asian American writers who had come before me, beginning in the late 19th century, who faced a level of incomprehension I can barely imagine. And always with me were the voices of all the Asian Americans and other people of color whose political and social movements had broached the walls of racism and indifference and given me the chance to speak and to be heard. I think of W.E.B. Du Bois's idea that black people always see themselves through their own eyes and those of others. I experienced that double consciousness too, to some degree. I was an American spying on my parents and a Vietnamese spying on Americans. But double consciousness is also experienced not only through the gaze, but also through the voice. I may speak for myself and only for myself, but I am perceived as speaking for others whether I like it or not, whether I want to or not. Instead of accepting this duality in which the so-called minority writer ventriloquizes the voiceless as their voice, I believe in two things. First, we all indeed have to find our own voices. But second, we must abolish the conditions of voicelessness. For Asian Americans, even claiming an individual voice is fraught. For our place in this country is to be the silent, acquiescent, apologetic model minority. We are neither expected to write nor to fight. We are not expected to speak alone, much less speak together. And yet, in the face of the anti-Asian violence that is perpetual in American society and routine in American warfare in Asia, and which has resurged during the pandemic, finding and claiming both our individual and collective voices is crucial. And here, what is so powerful about literature and storytelling, as always, as art and as weapons, is that they can teach us not only how to be alone, but also how to stand together. Thank you. Tucson, best roll, folks.